The average age of a B-17 crew member in 1943 was 22 years old. 22, most of them had never left their home state before the war. Some had never even seen an airplane up close. And within months of their enlistment, they were being strapped into a 65,000-pound Flying Fortress, sent 30,000 feet above Nazi-occupied Europe, and told to hold formation while flak tore through the fuselage, and Focke-Wulf 190s came screaming in at 400 miles per hour. The odds were not in their favor. In the summer of 1943, a bomber crew's statistical chance of completing a 25-mission tour without being killed, wounded, or captured hovered somewhere around 1 in 3. Those numbers weren't classified. The men knew them. They climbed in anyway. This is a story of what those young men faced, what the machine demanded of them, what the sky took from them, and why the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, for all its legendary status, was one of the most punishing environments any young American would ever be asked to survive. By late 1942, the United States Army Air Forces had committed to a strategy that was, by any honest measure, a gamble of staggering proportions. While the Royal Air Force had shifted to nighttime area bombing after suffering catastrophic daylight losses early in the war, American commanders, particularly General Carl Spaatz and Brigadier General Ira Eaker, remained convinced that precision daylight bombing was the path to strangling German industrial capacity. The doctrine was called the Combined Bomber Offensive, and it would be formalized at the Casablanca Conference in January 1943. The directive was clear: destroy the Luftwaffe and dismantle the industrial infrastructure feeding the Nazi war machine. The weapon chosen to carry this campaign was the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, specifically the B-17F and SEV. By mid-1943, the improved B-17G, the 8th Air Force, operating from bases scattered across East Anglia in England, would absorb the brunt of this campaign. And the men filling those aircraft, navigators, bombardiers, radio operators, gunners, co-pilots, and pilots, were being processed through training pipelines as fast as the Army Air Forces could run them. What those young men encountered when they finally reached their operational squadrons was a world that no training had fully prepared them for. The machine itself was formidable. The conditions inside it were medieval. The Boeing B-17F and G were not small aircraft. Standing beneath one on a fog-soaked English morning in 1943, the machine loomed enormous, 103 feet of wingspan, 4 Wright R182 097 Cyclone radial engines, producing 1,100 horsepower each, and an airframe designed to absorb punishment that would have shredded lesser aircraft. Boeing's engineering team, led by figures like Edward Wells, who had shaped the original Model 299 design back in 1935, had built something genuinely remarkable. The B-17 could lose an engine, take cannon fire through the wing, have its hydraulic systems shot out, and still sometimes bring its crew home. But the conditions inside that aircraft was something else entirely. When a young pilot climbed up through the forward belly hatch for the first time, he entered a world defined by cold, noise, and cramped mechanical chaos. The cockpit of a B-17 was not a comfortable place. The seats were functional rather than ergonomic, the instrument panel dense with jazz, and the visibility forward was partially obstructed by the greenhouse of plexiglass panels that formed the nose. For the pilot and co-pilot, the view out the side windows was dominated by the massive engine and they were surrounded by machinery in every direction. The heating system in the B-17 was, by the standards of 1943, inadequate. This was not an engineering failure so much as a physical reality. The aircraft flew at altitudes where the outside air temperature regularly reached 40 to 60 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. The electrically heated suits issued to gunners and other crew members helped, but they were also known to malfunction. When a heating element failed at altitude, frostbite could set in within minutes. Surgeons at 8th Air Force bases were amputating frozen fingers and toes throughout 1943. It was a quiet, unreported epidemic within the campaign. Oxygen was another constant adversary. Above 10,000 feet, crews were required to go on supplemental oxygen. Above 25,000 feet, where the B-17 typically flew its missions over Germany, the partial pressure of oxygen was so low that even a brief disconnection from the oxygen system could render a man unconscious within seconds. Hypoxia was insidious. It mimicked intoxication before it killed. Young gunners sometimes removed their oxygen masks to adjust equipment and never realized what was happening to them. Crew members were trained to watch each other constantly for signs of confusion or slumped posture. It was a life-or-death responsibility layered on top of everything else. The noise was another dimension of the ordeal that is almost impossible to convey in retrospect. For Wright's Cyclone engines at full power produced a roar that was less a sound than a physical assault. Crew members communicated through the interphone system, But that system was also unreliable, prone to interference, prone to battle damage, prone to going silent at precisely the wrong moment. During a fighter attack, a pilot might receive a call from his tail gunner and hear nothing but static. He would have no way of knowing whether the gunner was reporting an incoming attack, requesting assistance, or already dead. The formation flying demanded of B-17 crews was its own brutal science. The 8th Air Force developed the combat box formation, specifically to maximize the overlapping fields of fire from each aircraft's defensive guns. And it worked to a point. But maintaining formation required the pilot to hold precise throttle control for hours at a time, fighting turbulence, temperature changes, and the wake of aircraft ahead and beside him. The physical fatigue was relentless, a 6-to-tower mission and missions to deep targets inside. Germany could run longer, left crews wrung out in ways that went beyond ordinary exhaustion. And then there was the flak. German anti-aircraft defenses in 1943 were among the most sophisticated in the world. The 88mm flak 36 and 41 guns, DIRECTED, by Warsburg radar systems and optical fire control predictor units, could place concentrated fire at altitudes above 25,000 feet with frightening accuracy over major industrial targets like Schweinfurt, Hamburg, or Regensburg. The flak was dense enough that crews described it as walking through it a continuous assault that the aircraft had no choice but to absorb. Flak could punch through aluminum skin, detonate fuel tanks, sever control cables, and turn the interior of an aircraft into a shrapnel chamber without a second's warning. There was no maneuvering out of a flak barrage during a bomb run. Doctrine required straight and level flight for the bombardier. To use the Norden bomb sight, the pilots held course. The aircraft shook. Men died. The Norden bomb sight itself was a classified instrument of considerable sophistication, a gyroscopically stabilized analog computer that, when properly operated by a trained bombardier, could theoretically place bombs within 100 feet of a target from 20,000 feet. The reality was considerably messier. Weather, human error, formation bombing techniques, and the chaos of combat degraded accuracy significantly. But the bombardier was still the man on whom the entire mission theoretically pivoted. He carried the weight of the mission's purpose in that cramped plexiglass nose, surrounded by cold and noise, trying to hold his concentration while flak burst around him. The gunners occupied positions that were, in some cases, genuinely extraordinary in their exposure. The ball turret, a spherical Sperry A-13A unit mounted beneath the fuselage, housed a single gunner in a space so compact that men over 5 feet 5 inches tall were frequently deemed too large to fit. The gunner entered the turret through a hatch and rode in a fetal position for the duration of the mission, operating twin 50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns through a combined sight and hydraulic control system. If the aircraft was badly damaged and the turret's hydraulic system failed, the turret could become locked in a position that prevented the gunner from exiting before landing. A terrifying scenario, if the landing gear had also been damaged. It happened. Men died in ball turrets on crash landings. The waist gunners, standing at open or semi-enclosed windows on each side of the fuselage, were exposed to full slipstream blasts at altitude. In the early B-17F models, the waist gun windows were open, no plexiglass covering at all. The wind chill at speed and altitude was savage. By the time the B-17G was introduced, with staggered and partially enclosed waist positions in the latter half of 1943, the 8th Air Force had already accumulated an enormous casualty toll among its waist gunners. The tail gunner position was another world entirely. Crouched at the very rear of the aircraft in a kneeling position behind twin 50 calibers, the tail gunner's job was to defend the aircraft's most vulnerable aspect, the dead 6 o'clock approach favored by German fighter pilots. Tail gunners in 1943 faced Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt Bf 109s that had been specifically trained to attack from the rear, exploiting the B-17's initially weaker rear defensive coverage before the dedicated tail position was standardized. The men who flew in the tail were among the most exposed in the entire formation. Above all of this, the pilot and co-pilot were responsible for managing an aircraft that could be systematically dismembered by combat and still required precise handling. The B-17 was famously forgiving structurally, but a severely damaged aircraft was anything but easy to fly. With 1 or 2 engines out, a pilot faced asymmetric thrust that demanded constant rudder and aileron input. If hydraulic lines were severed, the control surfaces could become heavy and sluggish. If oxygen lines were hit, the entire crew was suddenly in mortal danger. If a fuel tank was burning, the pilot had perhaps seconds to decide whether a decision was required at all. The 8th Air Force's mission records from 1943 document this reality in stark numbers. The Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission of August 17, 1943. a twin-pronged attack on German ball bearing manufacturing and the Messerschmitt assembly plant resulted in the loss of 60 aircraft and 600 men in a single day. The second Schweinfurt mission on October 14, 1943, became known as Black Thursday. 60 more B-17s fell. Another 17 were so badly damaged they never flew again. The 8th Air Force temporarily suspended deep penetration missions into Germany without fighter escort. The strategic bombing campaign had reached a crisis point. What saved it partially was the gradual introduction of long-range fighter escort. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt had been operating with drop tanks since mid-1943, extending its range, but it still could not reach deep targets inside Germany. The North American P-51B Mustang, paired with the Packard-built Merlin engine, began reaching 8th Air Force groups in significant numbers by early 1944. That aircraft changed the campaign's mathematics fundamentally. But in 1943, the crews flying the missions had no such assurance. They flew into Germany knowing that once they passed a certain line of longitude, the escorting fighters would have to turn back. After that point, they were alone. The men who flew those missions were, almost universally, very young. The pilots were often no more than 23 or 24 years old, holding the rank of second or first lieutenant, responsible for 9 other lives, and a $65,000 aircraft every time they taxied to the end of the runway at Bassingbourn, or Thorpe Abbotts, or Pembroke. They had trained for perhaps 200 total flying hours. Some had considerably less. They learned the real curriculum in the air over Germany. Veterans of those missions have described a particular kind of institutional normalization that developed among the crews, a way of processing loss and continuing to function. When a crew failed to return, their equipment was redistributed, their personal effects were packed, and the empty bunks were filled within days by replacement crews who arrived with clean uniforms and insufficient experience. The machine required continuity. The men adapted or they did not survive long enough to adapt. The B-17 itself, for all the suffering conducted within it, became something more than an aircraft to the men who flew it. There is a documented pattern in the memoirs and interviews of 8th Air Force veterans, a genuine affection for the machine, an acknowledgement of its endurance, that translated into something approaching trust. The aircraft did, in many cases, bring men home when no rational engineering analysis would have predicted it could. Photographs from the period document aircraft landing with entire tail sections missing, with engine nacelles shot away, with holes large enough to step through punched in wings and fuselage. The Boeing structure held when it had no reasonable obligation to. That resilience was a documented design achievement. The B-17's semi-monocoque fuselage construction, its multiple redundant control systems, and the sheer structural mass of its main spars gave it a damage tolerance that German fighter pilots found genuinely frustrating. Targeting a B-17 with 20mm cannon and watching it absorb round after round and maintain its position in formation was a documented experience recounted by Luftwaffe pilots. It could be killed, certainly, and it was killed in enormous numbers, but it did not die easily. By the end of the war, the 8th Air Force had flown over 290,000 individual bomber sorties. It had lost 4,700 B-17s in combat over Europe. Over 47,000 American airmen had been killed. Nearly as many had been taken prisoner. They had been 22 years old. They had climbed into a machine most of them barely understood, in conditions that were barely survivable. And they had flown towards some of the most heavily defended airspace in human history. They did not do it because they were unafraid. The records are clear on that. They did it because the machine was there. The mission was assigned. And the man in the next bunk was depending on them to be in their seat when the engines turned over.